Welcome, everyone, to a new episode of the Makdisi Street podcast. My name is Usama Makdisi, and I'm joined, as always, by my brother Karim. Our older brother Seti is not here today, unfortunately, due to a scheduling mix-up. But special thanks to our producer, Sina, who reminds us to always tell our listeners and viewers to please, if you're watching this on YouTube, to subscribe and like. And if you're listening to it on various podcast forms, to give us a 5-star review if and when you can on whatever platform you happen to be listening to, especially because those who are extremely unhappy with our show, given its content and focus on Palestine recently, are trying to sort of undermine the show. So we also started a Patreon recently, and we're getting it. It's running at this point, and we encourage you to sign up if you're so inclined. It helps support the show. We post bonus content and shows and answer questions and answers on our various shows on that site. Our guest today, however, is someone who needs no real introduction, I'm sure, to most of our listeners and viewers. He is Professor Rashid Khalidi, who is the Edward Said Chair of Modern Arab Studies in the Department of History at Columbia University. Professor Khalidi Rashid is the most distinguished historian of the modern Middle East. Before joining Columbia, Professor Khalidi trained a generation of students in modern Middle Eastern history at the University of Chicago. And before that, he was an assistant professor at Karim's current department of PSPA, Political Science and Public Administration at the American University of Beirut. Professor Khalidi became the editor of the Journal of Palestine Studies in 2002. He was the president of the Middle East Studies Association. He's also been an advisor to the Palestinian delegation in Madrid and Washington, the Arab-Israeli peace negotiations in October 91 to June 1993. And most famously to most of our viewers and listeners, he's, of course, the author of numerous books, the most recent of which is the best-selling The 100 Years' War on Palestine, History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance, 1917 to 2017, which is published in many different languages and which really gives probably the most concise and important sort of summary and analysis for a general audience of the history of what is happening and what has been happening for the past century. Rashid is also the author of The Iron Cage and the author of many other books, including the construction of the Palestinian identity, the construction of modern national consciousness in 1996. He's a leading public intellectual, and as such, of course, Rashid has been exposed both to extraordinary sort of fame and also extraordinary attacks by mostly Zionists because of his position on Palestine and his advocacy for honest integrity, honest history of Palestine and the Palestinians. So, Rashid, welcome to our show. It's great to have you with us. And we'd like to ask you at the beginning, Karim and I would like to ask you, as we ask all our guests, to give us a sense of your biography. In other words, why history? Why did you become a historian? Just a little bit, just for our listeners and viewers, how you became the historian you are today.
Yeah, well, thanks so much. Thanks so much for having me. How did I become a historian? I became sort of overdetermined. My father worked for the United Nations in the Security Council, and he was himself a student of history. He got a PhD actually from Columbia, and was studying at Columbia when he met my mother. So I was surrounded by books. I was part of a family that paid a lot of attention to Palestine. My father worked in the Security Council on the Middle East. So every time the Middle East was discussed at the Security Council, he would come home and that was the dinner table conversation. So it was sort of fated that I would be knowledgeable about and interested in and unable to get away from the topic of Middle Eastern history and Palestine in particular. And then, you know, things took their course. I went to Oxford. I had the fortune of working with Albert Harani, who was probably the preeminent modern historian of the Middle East of his generation. as did many other people. And I learned a great deal from him, especially about teaching and about supervising students, which I've done an enormous amount of. I've been teaching now for 50 years. And I've either been the supervisor of or the co-supervisor of, or, an important member of the committee of more than 60 students, PhD students. And I owe all of that really to Albert Hourani and how he trained people and how the kind of attention that he gave to his PhD students. So I guess that's, a potted version of how I came to be a historian.
Okay, so Rashid, I mean, actually, we can take the thread of Albert Hourani in a moment in terms of my sense of Albert Hourani, of course, as a great historian of the Middle East, a person of Lebanese extraction, born in Manchester, raised in Manchester. But the interesting thing is the difference between you as a scholar of Palestine and as someone who is very much in the public eye and has been in the public eye for decades at this point, and has written extensively on Palestine and centered Palestine in your scholarship, as well as in your public intellectual work, as opposed to Hourani, who seemed to shy away from Palestine. We know at certain. So there seems to be how does that sort of figure in your thinking about the difference, his mentorship over you, but also the divergence between the two of you? He was very reticent, was he not, on Palestine? Once after the Nakba, he stopped talking about Palestine in a sense.
Well, it's not exactly correct. In fact, after he went back to England in the mid-50s, he became extremely reticent. You're right, but he spent years teaching at the American University of Beirut. In fact, he taught my father in the 30s. He worked with the British government in the Middle East during World War II, and then he worked with the Arab Office, which was a Palestinian attempt to set up a Palestinian foreign ministry / Ministry of Information for 3 years after World War II.
So this is before the Nakba, correct? 46. This is 46.
Right up to the Nakba, precisely. And that was a very, I gather, I've looked at some of his papers. I've looked at some of the Musa al-Alami papers. I've looked at the papers on this period. And it seems that this was a terribly disappointing and difficult experience for him. And the Nakba brought the whole thing crashing down. Soon after that, he went back to England. And from that point on, you're right, actually. He was quite reticent about Palestine. I mean, I'm different than him, obviously, in many respects. For one thing, my father was Palestinian. For another thing, after my father died, my mother moved back to Beirut, and Beirut was my home for 15 years. And that was the height of the involvement of the Palestinian resistance movement, the PLO, in Lebanon.
So this is in the 70s? You're talking about the 1970s?
I'm talking about the 60s and the 70s. My mom moved back to Beirut in 1968. So that was my home base from the late 60s until actually 1983. And I was obviously deeply involved in Palestinian politics. I was dealing with journalists all the time. So I took a completely different path, obviously, from him. At the same time as I was publishing my first book, I was doing research on Soviet policy in the Middle East at the Institute for Palestine Studies. I was teaching full-time at the AUB for 7 years. I was teaching at the Lebanese University. I overlapped for a couple of years at the Lebanese University in the mid-70s. So I was doing a bunch of other things as well as politics. So it's you're right, it's a different trajectory than Hourani's.
Karim, jump in whenever you want. But in terms of I could keep going on this thread, but in terms of the Hourani, well, let's end with the Hourani thread here and then move on to something else. But in terms of, so the reticence you said is due to the fact that he was disappointed or crushed or upset, you said, based on your readings of his papers and so on. Is it he was disappointed in his inability and our inability as scholars to change the steamroller of colonial Zionism in Palestine? Or was he disappointed in our inability or the Palestinian inability to actually organize itself? Which was it? And how does that affect you and your thinking?
It was the latter, I think. He was not involved in my understanding for most of the late 30s and the 40s with the historiographical or the narrative or the discursive battle around Palestine. he was actually involved and saw firsthand the vicious Arab rivalries, the weakness of the Palestinian leadership, the military imbalance with the Zionist movement. I mean, he was living in Palestine, and he experienced all of that firsthand, right up to the Nakba. I don't know exactly when he left. I don't have those details, but it is very, very clear from talking to people who knew him in those days. I mean, Rashid Khalidi, my cousin, knew him very, very well. And I've talked to him and to others who knew him. And I've read mainly Musa Alami stuff and Arab office stuff that has now been seized by the Israelis. It was in Faisal Husseini's Arab Studies Center in Jerusalem. The material on the Arab office. I have notes, but the documents are no longer, as far as I know, accessible, except in some part of the Israeli National Library under a heading of AP, abandoned property. It wasn't abandoned, it was stolen. The Israeli army took it. And now it's I understand. Last person who I talked to who saw it was many years ago. Anyway, so that's how I saw the materials. And I know about this also from talking to people. I think he was deeply disappointed and hurt and that was the end of it for him, I think. He witnessed the Nakba. And I would say that there are people of that generation that I've known and I know for whom the Nakba crushed their spirit. They were no longer able to function. I mean, they functioned in their daily life, but they ceased to have hope. I don't know if that was true of Albert. I mean, I actually never talked to him about it, so I don't know. I mean, I was in my 20s when I was a graduate student with him. I wasn't going to talk to him about those things.
Rashid, could I jump in here? You were saying that Albert, was, let's say, disappointed in the leadership at the time, and you've written. Someone mentioned your most recent book on the 100 years of war on Palestine, and we're going to talk obviously about the connection with October 7th and what happened afterwards today. But a theme that comes through this, and I think it would be maybe interesting since you've written so much about it and about the mandate period and sort of the subsequent periods, and you've written so much about the PLO and this theme of leadership within Palestine and among the Palestinians. It seems to have been, there seems to be something where there's this absence of leadership, or ones where if there is some form of leadership, very quickly there's a kind of conspiracy to crush it, a kind of effective leadership, whether during the mandate period, during the uprising, in the 30s, even during the Arafat years. So could you talk a little bit about this theme of leadership or the absence of leadership? And obviously, we're going to get to the kind of contemporary period where there seems to be a total absence of leadership.
I mean, the Palestinians, frankly, have been very unfortunate in their leadership, in my view, throughout their modern history. Maybe in the Ottoman period, they had a few people who properly represented them. But from the mandate period onwards, in my view, largely for social reasons. I mean, the leadership in that period represented a class that was not in touch with the bulk of the Palestinian population. It lived with the delusion that simply persuading the British would suffice to make them change their policy. And people understood different classes of society, educated young people, people who were dealing with land acquisition and dispossession on the ground, knew that the British were fully behind the Zionist project, and that nothing that was said at a garden party or a tea party or in the colonial office would change them. And I don't think that until a very, very late stage, the Palestinian leadership understood that. Maybe when it doesn't matter when, sometime in the late 30s, maybe they began to understand it. And there are many other reasons why I think the leadership was inadequate in that period. Then there was a period where there was no leadership after the Nakba. And it took a long time for society to tie itself together in the aftermath, immediate aftermath of the Nakba. And the other thing to remember, and older people have said this to me, that it's lacking in some of my work, is that all the time the British and the Zionists were working to divide the Palestinian national movement. All the time, every lesson British imperialism had learned from Ireland through India through Egypt about how to control a population through manipulating their leaders, bribing some of them, giving some of them emoluments, giving others of them hope that if they just did this, that, and the other, Britain would change its policy. They were working at that constantly. And they had apt pupils in the Zionists who were learning how to be colonialists from the British. I mean, this actually went down to the level of tactics and training in counterinsurgency. Almost every senior officer in what later became the Israeli army was trained by British counterinsurgency specialists in the late 1930s. The intelligence people, the legal people. I mean, the structure of the Israeli state was there long before May 15th, 1948. And it had been built up with the help of the British and along a British model in some respects. And with British training and help. I mean, you had people running departments who were passionate Zionists from Herbert Samuel on down. Their idea was to create a Jewish state there, to help the Zionist movement create a Jewish state. And so you had every nasty tactic that Britain had ever devised for screwing nationalist movements and undermining them and suborning them and dividing them was being employed in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s. At the same time as the Zionists were sitting at their knee learning how to do this. And you see a seamless transition after May 15th. I mean, the 1945 emergency laws are kept in place. The same people who were trained by Ord Wingate and all these other famous British counterinsurgency specialists become generals in the Israeli army. Moshe Dayan, Yigal Allon, Yitzhak Sadeh, and many, many others. So there's a direct continuity in methods between the two, and that obviously sapped and suborned and weakened Palestinian leadership. Ever since 1948, Israel has worked along the same lines. Assassinating. The book by Ronan Bergman, everybody should read. Rise and Kill First. He details hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of assassinations. If you want to know why Palestinian leadership is so weak, it's because the best ones are underground. They're dead. I don't mean in tunnels. I mean they've been buried because they were assassinated. Now, some of them were assassinated by Arab governments, but most of them were assassinated by Israel. So that's another reason for the weakness of Palestinian leadership. There are many others.
Given that, Rashid, given that point that you're raising in response to Karim's question about leadership, and you're obviously in all of your work and your previous works, you often have criticized Palestinian leadership, correctly so. So the question then is, given what you just said right now, that essentially the deck was stacked and it was basically they had no chance. If I understand what you're saying correctly now, you're saying essentially they were up against the might of the British Empire and all the history of British repression, of anti-colonial movements, of peoples, of native peoples around the world, all concentrated in a focused form on Palestine. Did they have a chance? I mean, did anyone have a chance for that matter, given what you're saying right now? So I'm trying to reconcile, how does one criticize them and say that they had no chance?
I mean, I just issued the caveat. I mean, to be too harsh about them without taking into account the odds that they were up against would be completely unfair. Yes, they were detached from their people. Yes, they were sometimes deluded. Yes, they were divided. The British divided them very successfully. But they were up against, a situation that they were not the only ones to face. Between World War I and World War II, not one single people under colonial rule freed themselves except the Irish. Between 1918 and 1939, not one colony managed to liberate itself. After World War II and the era of decolonization, boom, 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 boom. But up until 1939, it didn't happen. Now, Egypt and Iraq and Syria had some success, but actually the British were still in occupation and the French were still in occupation of these countries. They still controlled them. So they'd gone from a colonial to a neo-colonial situation. But otherwise, with the sole exception of the Irish, who took advantage of a specific situation and had, built up a huge head of steam over 7 centuries of British colonial settler rule, nobody managed to free themselves in that period. So you can't blame the Palestinian leadership. They weren't the only ones. The Indians didn't free themselves. The Nigerians, the Egyptians, nobody managed to free themselves.
So Rashid, sorry, I just want to follow up on this. So the idea is that during this mandate period and before the Nakba even, the British were sort of supporting, assisting, and pushing the Zionists at the time. So by the time they declared their state, the proto-institutions were already there, including the army, right? All these institutions are already there. But also at the same time, any attempts at creation of Palestinian institutions were being actively destroyed, right? It's not that they were not being done. They were actually also being destroyed, correct? Do I understand that?
They were not allowed, the British did not allow any form of self-rule for the Palestinians while they were building up the machinery of government, of self-rule for the Jewish population of Palestine.
So then the relationship, so that's a kind of, and that I think we'll carry this theme a little bit longer, because that kind of the role of the British and then the Americans and this kind of larger kind of colonial structure obviously continues until this day. But just while we're talking historically still, the relationship between the Palestinian, what emerges as the Palestinian leadership, eventually through the PLO, and the various kind of Arab states, how does that evolve? I mean, what is that relationship? I mean, it's Abdel Nasser, obviously, but even before that and after that, in that period, what is that relationship, and at what point does there emerge, at least after 1948, a kind of Palestinian leadership that is autonomous or independent of this larger Arab kind of configuration?
I mean, I think you have to look very carefully at the Arab states in the period of decolonization to understand, first of all, why they were so disunited, to understand, second of all, why they remained under the thumb of colonial powers, even though they were nominally independent for so long. So you have a country like Jordan, right up until 1956, 57. The British ambassador was the most important, and the British commander of the Jordanian army were the two most important people in Amman. It wasn't an independent country. Even countries where foreign troops had withdrawn, countries like Syria, Iraq, Iraq had British troops until 58. Even countries where foreign troops had withdrawn, the influence of the old imperial powers or of new powers, whether the United States or the Soviet Union, was often paramount. And in addition, you had these extraordinary divisions of places that were not nation states before 1918. I mean, people harp perhaps overmuch on Sykes-Picot and the divisions that were imposed on the Middle East as a result of Anglo-French, map drawing in 1915 and 16. But there's no question that there were possibilities just immediately after the war that were snuffed out. And there were structures that were created entirely and solely to serve the interests of the imperial powers. They had nothing to do with the interests of the peoples. I mean, eventually within those frameworks, national consciousness developed. So you have a Kuwaiti national consciousness, you have a Lebanese national, you have a Jordanian national consciousness. These things did not exist as nation states in 1899. And those structures had an enormously negative effect on Palestine. They could not agree on how to deal with the Palestine issue. Could not then, do not now. Except that most of them now do exactly what the United States wants. That's the only qasim mushtarak, the only common factor between most Arab states today. The only thing they can more or less agree upon is whatever Washington says, yes, sirree. But aside from that, they're at odds with one another and have been. And the Palestinians have had to. I mean, I would compare Arafat dealing with this situation of inter-Arab rivalries to somebody leaping from one ice floe to another just to survive over the whole period that he was alive. And it wasn't a pretty business. It made for some extraordinarily ugly policies and actions. I could go into detail if you want. The point is that to some extent, those were the cards the Palestinians were dealt. You have an Arab world where the people are sympathetic to you, are now, were then, have always been. You go back to the pre-World War I period, hundreds of articles on Zionism in the Arab press. Okay. Now today they say, oh, this is a manipulation. People are forcing the poor Palestinians to be nationalists. No. Or the Arab masses are being deluded by their rulers or whatever. No. In a free press before 1914, you had dozens and dozens and hundreds of articles on Zionism. And you had support for the Palestinians through the 20s and the 30s. There was a museum in the basement of the Qasr al-Azam, the Azam Palace in Hama, of martyrs who fought in Palestine in the 1930s. Dozens of them. They just went. And they felt this was a cause. There were Egyptians, there were Palestinians, there were Lebanese, there were Syrians, there were Jordanians, there were Iraqis. So Arafat and the PLO had to navigate these shark-infested waters, dealing not only with Israel or with hostile powers like the United States, which has been the most fervent enemy of Palestinian nationalism since certainly the 60s, more fervent in some ways than Israel, or at least as fervent, but also the incredibly divisive and petty rivalries of Arab regimes with one another, and their intention to try and play the Palestinian card in their favor. Most Arab regimes, many Arab regimes had their own groups that they fostered within the Palestinian movement. The Libyans did this, the Iraqis did this, the Syrians did this, the Egyptians did this. And it was within that context that Palestinian leadership had to operate. And one can criticize them, but again, as with the period in the 20s and the 30s, you have to recognize the difficulties. You can say they didn't do very well and that they should have done this or could have done that, but you have to recognize those obstacles.
So, Rashid, on that point, I mean, if I were to push you a little bit more on that point and say, of course, what you say makes absolute sense and is true as a historian and as looking at the situation of the Mandate era and the British and the French divide and rule, and then the US divide and rule after the British. But would you not say the same thing for the Arab states and the Arab leaders in the sense that they also were in a fundamentally weak position in the sense that
Absolutely.
There was no Ottoman army left. The Ottoman army became the rump of the Turkish state army. And so the Arabs had very little chance themselves. And so that's one question. The second question following up on that is this issue. Karim and I always debate this point, which is that, I often say there's an Arab facade. The British, of course, use that term, the Arab facade, to justify the Arab facade, creating these Arab states as a front behind which, of course, they continue to dominate, as you explained in the case of Jordan, Iraq, Kuwait, and all these other states that the British help set up, and so that way bypassing self-determination. But then the question is, to what extent do these states actually have interests? To what extent? I mean, even today, when we look at what's going on between Iran and Israel, the Arab states are almost completely absent, except for the fact that the Jordanians are shooting down Iranian drones, allegedly.
Probably Americans based in Jordan that did it.
Yeah, probably. But there seems to be a total absence of Arab sovereignty today. But then Karim and we argue, and his point is that, no, they have their own, if they're not just lapdogs or poodles of the US, they have their own interests. I don't know if that's something you want to pursue.
I wonder to what extent you can identify the interests of the military junta that rules Algeria, or the pouvoir, which is made up of former military, or Egypt, or of these ruling families, with their states or their peoples. I mean, what is there that these leaderships, these regimes, have in common with their peoples? In what way do they represent the interests of their peoples? In my view, not very much in most cases. The weaker states, the ones with some democratic forms like Kuwait or Lebanon, are more representative of their peoples, obviously, because they have to be. That doesn't mean you don't have a kleptocracy, which is stealing the country blind and taking a huge share of the country's wealth, whether we're talking about Kuwait or we're talking about Lebanon. But you have public opinion that has an impact on the country's policy, and the rulers can't do as they please. In other countries, it's basically a jackboot dictatorship, whether it's the kind of absolute monarchy that makes Louis XIV look like a Democrat, as in the United Arab Emirates, or whether it's, this horrific police state, as in Saddam's Iraq or Syria or Egypt or Algeria. In all of those cases, I don't see those regimes as representing the interests of their peoples. I mean, if they represented the interests of their peoples, a country that is rich like Algeria would have developed economically much more than it has. You wouldn't have this huge unemployment rate. You wouldn't have this desperation of people to emigrate. And they have oil and gas and uranium, for heaven's sakes. It's being stolen, obviously, and it's being badly managed. And one can say the same thing about many other Arab countries. So I don't see a huge contradiction, frankly. They're poodles and lapdogs, partly because they don't represent their people, partly because they don't have the kind of legitimacy that they would have if they did, and partly because they're dependent on outside forces, to some extent, at least some of them, for support against their own peoples.
So how do you support, Karim? Just wait 1 second to follow up, and then Karim will jump in. How do you then answer this criticism that is often heard? I had a Syrian friend here the other day, and he said to me, Osama, you have to understand that in Syria, the regime has used the Palestine cause relentlessly, as of course have other regimes, relentlessly to help subordinate their own people, to the point where people in Syria, this person claims, are sort of, he said, of course, in their hearts, they're for Palestine, but they're sick of listening to the discourse, the official discourse about Palestine. So how does you get to a point where there's a sort of an identification with the cause, but there's also, the reality is that Palestinians have been persecuted in various Arab states and Arab countries, and there's a sense of exhaustion, alleged exhaustion on the part of people who don't want to be lectured on Palestine. Do you see what I'm saying? So how do you think, and how do you answer that kind of observation?
Well, I think the first thing you have to do is to admit that your interlocutor is basically right about a regime like the Syrian regime. You would say bitejru. I mean, they're how would you translate that? They're doing commerce with the Palestine question. For them, it is a popular cause, and so they pretend that they're, furthering that cause. And Arab regimes have done that since the beginning. Really, you can find that in the 30s, even with not fully independent governments. You certainly find it as soon as the Arab League is founded, and in 1948, and you find it ever since. I wrote an article once where I showed about how it was essentially regime self-interest and raison d'etat that drove everything that Abdel Nasser did and several other Arab governments or rulers did in the period up to the 1967 war. They weren't particularly concerned as governments, as regimes, as rulers with the cause or with the Palestinian people. They had their own concerns as leaders and rulers and regimes. So they have regime interests. Sometimes that's just filling my pockets. And sometimes it's more. It has broader. For example, Egypt wanted to develop. They didn't want distractions. Abdel Nasser wanted to build the high dam. Abdel Nasser wanted to industrialize. Abdel Nasser wanted to do a bunch of other things. He oppressed his own people. He pretended to support Palestine in the interest of getting external investment that would enable him to do these things. Didn't work, but that was the idea.
What Rashid, you mean to say that Nasser didn't care about Palestine, or wasn't genuine in his sympathy for the Palestinians? You think?
No, I don't think he cared very much.
I mean, so how do you compare him to a current ruler?
I mean, you read his memoir, and he says, "Our eyes." He's writing about when he was in the Egyptian army, with a unit that was besieged at a place called Fallujah, and he says, "Our eyes were on the enemy, or our eyes were on, but our hearts or our minds were back in Cairo. They were concerned about Egypt." They were fighting in Palestine. I mean, they were fighting. Some of them were killed. I mean, there's a commitment there. I'm not saying it's complete. It's cynical. But the real concern was we have to go back and change the government that put us in this situation. And he always made that. The Egyptian regime always made that argument. Only when Egypt is strong can Egypt confront Israel. But then you look at what they were doing on the side and the kinds of deals that they were trying to make with the United States and with Israel. And you have to at least qualify that. I mean, I don't want to go into a disquisition on Egyptian foreign policy, but it really essentially was driven by raison d'etat. You can read the article. You can disagree with me.
No, I want to push a little bit more, which is, so if we're talking about the poodles, you mentioned the question of the poodles today. Some of the Arab states are poodles. And you could throw in the UK.
That was actually your brother's
Yeah, well,
expression, but
okay.
I
No,
willfully
we
adopted
agree, and I mean, you could throw the UK, you could throw some of these European states in there, you can throw a bunch of other states into the poodle category. But the flip side of that is there's also been, and maybe not, because now that you've said this about Abdel Nasser, maybe my question is set up wrong. That there's also this history of resistance. And I'm not now talking now but not at the Palestinian level, but at sort of at the larger, let's say, Arab level, or was the Arab states at a certain juncture, maybe after '67, that dies, but then in the kind of contemporary phase, you have the what comes to be the axis of resistance, including, so you have now Yemen fighting, you've got Lebanon, you've got Iraq, you've got there's some, so you've got these different. And this is a serious form. One, a lot of people are going to interpret it cynically, but it does come from this. It doesn't have to be a question of saying, well, we're doing this only because we love Palestinians and we want to support Palestinians as such, but more that they're against this larger colonial project from which the Israelis come in and for which it creates this problem in Palestine and therefore creates a problem in the region. Right, so this larger resistance that Abdel Nasser had in the first case, and now, or what Abdel Nasser represented, at least in that phase, and what the axis of resistance today represents, doesn't have to be interpreted at the level of purely everything they do is in the name of the villager somewhere in Gaza, but more as a resistance to a larger imperial project, which in turn, if that somehow can be defeated in some kind of way, would bring that relief to the Palestinians, because there's no other way. Certainly not through negotiation, which every now and then kind of you come up with this negotiation, which I want to ask you about a little bit later. But I'm curious now about how you see. Is there any kind of continuity in this question of resistance from this earlier phases in the kind of in the 48 onwards, and then this kind of contemporary phase where the axis of resistance countries kind of are pushing? Again, we'll leave the Palestinian resistance aside for just a minute. Of course, we're going to come. That's very important. We'll come back to it.
I think you have to distinguish again between one country and another, and between people and governments. I mean, today I think if you look at the way the Yemenis are fighting or trying to contribute to relieve the pressure on Gaza, I think that represents a popular movement. I don't think that it's possible. You look at the pictures. The Houthis are not a democratic kumbaya type movement, and they certainly have a lot of they are repressive in many ways. But I think that on this issue, they represent the real sentiment of many Yemenis, maybe probably most Yemenis, and that may be true in some of these other cases of this so-called axis of resistance. I think you have to be a little more cynical about it, though. I mean, let's go back to Abdel Nasser. If Abdel Nasser really thought that the Palestine question was the most important issue there was, why did he have 60,000 troops in Yemen at the time of the 1967 war? Now, you could say, for this sort of anti-colonial reasons, that, Britain's control over South Yemen and Saudi Arabia's attempt as a pawn of the United States to dominate Yemen after the Yemeni revolution obliged him. I would argue that was part of it, that there was genuine, ideology. And I would argue that part of it was just competition for leadership in the Arab world with King Faisal after Faisal becomes king. And half the part of the time of the Yemen war, he's prime minister. So, you could take your pick. And I would argue the same thing about Iran. I mean, to some extent, this is a matter of Iran having some ideological commitment, I'm sure, at some level, maybe religious, maybe another level, to Palestine. And mainly it's, struggle for leadership in the region. They want to see, the United States has been completely hostile to the Iranian Revolution ever since it took place. And the United States has created or tried to create a ring of countries around Iran that were equally hostile to the Iranian Revolution. They failed in Afghanistan. They failed in Iraq, though the United States still has bases in Iraq. And for the Iranians, that's the main thing. Palestine is part of it. But I would look at raison d'etat again. I would look at, cold calculations of leaderships that want to stay in power, that B, have to deal with hostile foreign powers, and that C, have ideological commitments in that order.
Oh, sorry. I just, if allow me, just because I want to just follow this. The question, just to get to the question of Iran, simply because we just had a couple of days ago, of course, the Iranians just attacked the Israelis for the first time in this kind of direct way, in this very dramatic way. And regardless of how one wants to interpret it, the people are, going from extreme cynicism, this is all theater and, it's all BS basically, to this is the most profound thing that has happened. It certainly is something that is very new. It's the first time there's a direct Iranian attack, retaliation that goes directly to the Israelis that I think has a huge psychological, if not physical, had a huge psychological impact and sets up the region for something that's in which either we're heading to some kind of much bigger regional war that's going to draw on all these countries in the region, including Lebanon, or perhaps some kind of regional kind of solution of some kind that might then involve the just kind of resolution of the Palestine question, or anything in between. But the question that I was trying to ask on this is, it doesn't, one doesn't need to interpret, for example, this axis of resistance, including Hezbollah, including these, one doesn't need to interpret them as acting on behalf of the Palestinians, per se, but more against the colonial structure that's in place. And I'm just asking because, your this book, of course, you make that argument exactly and very, very, very beautifully when you were saying it's this 100 years of kind of a colonial war, basically, in which the Palestinians and those supporting Palestine and the resistances are not fighting a one-on-one battle against the Zionists and Israelis, but you're fighting against the British and the Americans and and everything in between. So how can one think about, even historically, let alone now, how can one think about resisting in this context of this 100 plus years of kind of a colonial structure, the structure of colonialism, let alone settler colonialism, without forces like these axis of resistance trying to inflict some kind of damage in that way? So, in other words, if you remove all of that, would the Palestinians be better off? I mean, would there be a guarantee of a just solution?
I mean, I'm not quite clear on what question you're asking me here, Cuddy. Are you saying? Well, frame it one more time.
No, I'm asking about the kind of the importance of this resistance and how it kind of evolves from the days of Abdel Nasser in those days, sort of, the non-Palestinian resistance, the way in which the Arab resistance, Abdel Nasser and others, in that period of Arab nationalism, and how they try to, you're saying, use or defend or kind of combine this notion. Can there be a resolution to the question of Arab nationalism without helping to solve the Palestine question? Can you have proper Arab nationalism going on as long as, and the same thing today?
Let me tell you what I think. I still haven't got a clear understanding of what you're asking, but let me give you what I think you're asking about. Let me give you my answer. I think that there is inevitably going to be resistance to the settler colonial process. And there will inevitably be resistance to the imperial neo-colonial domination of this region. And that is not going to be an easy matter. It's the most strategic region in the world. It happens to have a huge proportion of the world's hydrocarbons. We're nowhere near a transition away from them. And you got to go through the Middle East. Every time something happens in the Middle East, a ship gets stuck in the Suez Canal or the Houthis sink a ship. Suddenly everybody realizes since the time of the Phoenicians, this has been strategically the most critical part of the world. Okay? It'll never stop being that. So you're going to be fighting attempts at neocolonialism, imperial, whatever, for a very long time. Because whatever great power there is going to want to have their finger in this region. Okay? Going back to Hannibal and going back to the Hittites and the Assyrians. I mean, the Pharaohs, whatever, Romans, whatever. So there's going to be resistance, and there's going to be resistance in what's happening in Palestine is a specific settler colonial form of external control, which is complicated because of factors I talk about in the book. If Zionism were just a settler colonial project and there was a home country to which these people belonged and they could go there, you could have an Algerian solution, or you could have an Irish or a South African solution. But you cannot have it. You cannot. There's no what has happened in Palestine is unique, even in terms of settler colonial regimes. The second thing I would say is that you have to, I think, be a little more cynical about what you describe as resistance. I mean, let's take good old Abdel Nasser, and then I'll go to Iran. Let's take good old Abdel Nasser. Good old Abdel Nasser's regime was throwing Palestinians in jail because they resisted until the Israelis blew up a military base and a police post in 1955. At that point, his secret police took the Palestinians whom they had been torturing in jails out of jail and gave them guns and told them go and carry out Fidei operations, 55, 56. After the Suez War, which Israel and Britain and France launched in October 1956, and in which they conquered Sinai and the Gaza Strip, the Egyptians sealed the border hermetically. No operations crossed the Egyptian border, then or ever. So Abdel Nasser, who I would argue was trying to resist American hegemony in many ways, and in that sense you can see him as resisting, as far as Palestine was concerned. And in many other respects, I would argue some of what he was doing in Yemen was part of the same attempt to resist American hegemony and the dominance of American clients and allies. As far as Palestine was concerned, there's a couple of brief periods when he's supportive of Palestinian aims, and most of the time, no, it's subordinated to how Egypt thinks these things are to be done. Somebody once told me they went to the chef de cabinet of Abdel Nasser with some proposal from the PLO, and the response was in Arabic, these matters are decided here. It's not up to you, Palestinians, to decide. That's how Egypt looked at things and looks at things.
But on that point, Rashid, so just to push back a little bit, I think I want to try to rephrase Karim's question. His point was that you're suggesting that raison d'etat is always juxtaposed against an identification with Palestine.
No, not always.
Well, no, but I think that was Karim's point. In other words, there's a sense of resistance in which Palestine inevitably, in the question of Palestine, inevitably gets entangled. And there's no way to resist the colonial project without dealing with Palestine. Abdel Nasser realized this in 1955, you could say, with the attack on Gaza, with the attack on the Egyptian base, and then, of course, with the Israeli invasion, with Britain and France in 56, the tripartite sort of the war, the invasion of Sinai and Egypt, and that sort of colonial collusion and collaboration. So because the issue I have with this kind of framing, although I understand what you're trying to say, and I think one has to be cynical to an extent, but as a historian, how do you figure out what is ideology? You keep referring to ideology and the importance of ideology and commitment, and the fact that Abdel Nasser was genuinely anti-colonial. I don't think there's any question about that. He was also genuinely interested in Egyptian development, or he wouldn't have done these land reforms had he not been interested in or nationalizing the Suez Canal.
Built the dam, or
yeah, exactly. He wasn't just filling his pockets. So
no, he wasn't filling his pockets at all. In contradistinction to every one of these kleptocrats that we have now,
precisely,
all over the Arab world.
Which is why I want to defend Abdel Nasser a little bit and push back on this, because otherwise, if your reading of raison d'etat then ends up, perhaps, I know you're not saying this, but just to clarify this for our listeners and viewers, because it sounds, one could hear you and say, well, you're basically saying that Abdel Nasser is the same as Sisi today. That there's no difference between any of these Arab regimes. They all just use Palestine. I know you're not saying that, so I just want you to clarify that, because just so that there's no...
I think I said that in response to something that Karim asked.
Okay, because that's his point is like, and how as a historian do you separate the business of these interests and ideology? When you're a historian, you're looking through a document. How do you make sense of that?
I mean, ideology is really hard to weigh. It's really hard to weigh. I mean, I read things about Hamas. I read things about Iran, and it's very hard for me to determine to what extent ideology really is the driver, and to what extent other things are the drivers. And it's very hard to come to a conclusion, to a conclusive answer to some of those questions. I think with Abdel Nasser, let's finish with Abdel Nasser. I think you're absolutely right. Abdel Nasser saw himself as resisting, first of all, expelling colonialism. Remember, the British ran much of South Arabia and Oman. I mean, Abdelaziz Takriti's book, and
Egypt,
into the 70s. When this Hamas leader, I forget which one it was assassinated, or they tried to assassinate him in Dubai or Abu Dhabi. It turned out that the chief of the secret police was still a Brit in the 90s, for God's sakes. So Abdel Nasser was a resolute opponent of colonialism and of neocolonialism. There's no question about that. Now, he had a somewhat different, somewhat more, nuanced approach to the Soviets and the Americans. Because, and this is not a matter of raison d'etat. If you're going to get the British out, you need the help of the other guys. But at the same time, they have their own interests, and you don't want to be dominated by them. And he tried to play that, as did many other Arab rulers. He did it more successfully than most of the others. But does that mean that he was in, hot resistance mode 24/7? No. There were times when he understood that he and Egypt had to cool it over Palestine, for example. Egypt does not only nothing, in my view, for Palestine between 1957, when they recover Sinai, and 1967, when they lose Sinai, when they recover Gaza and Sinai, and in 68. They actively obstruct Palestinian resistance. I mean, if you look at the first stages of Palestinian, read Arafat and Abu Jihad and Abu Yad's memoirs. I mean, they gave those people hell. And right up until 67, 68, the Palestinian group that was the closest to Egypt, Harakat al-Qawmi al-Arab, was completely opposed to resistance, armed resistance. They said, no, the big brother Egypt has to take the lead. So, yes, anti-colonial, yes, trying to limit the hegemony of the great powers in the region. But does this mean, resistance 24/7? Absolutely not. And where Palestine was concerned, he said, when Egypt is strong, then we will do something about that. Now, that may be Bukra fil Mishmish, when the apricots bloom. And that may have been, he may have actually thought, one day I will launch a battle of liberation. I personally doubt that. His acceptance of 242 would indicate something else. But anyway.
Okay, so we have two. Karim, do you want to ask, or there's a section we want to move on at some point. We want to get to of course, the horror and the genocide of Gaza, and you were reading of it as a historian. But before we get that, Karim, should we segue to the question of Colombia and Rashid, your experience? I mean, how do you balance this kind of nuanced understanding, this attempt to sort of balance ideology and a reading of history and the raison d'etat, as you were explaining earlier, the contradictions, the overlap, and so on, and the Ottoman history and then post-Ottoman history? How do you balance all that attempt at being a nuanced historian with being a Palestinian and Arab historian in America, given the extraordinary Orientalism that we're all constantly dealing with? And what is the situation? How has the historical profession, if I could ask you, developed on the question of Palestine over your 50, you said you were teaching 50 years, over 50 years of instruction? Is it better? Is it worse? How do you feel as a Palestinian historian when you see Israeli historians constantly being, I mean, now, of course, you're an exception because of your book and your work, your recent work, and you're not your recent work, but you're the 100 Years' War, which is a best-selling book. But until your book, it's almost always Israeli historians who dominate the debate, and they frame the debate, and it's question, is it this guy or this guy? And I'm wondering to what extent, this is a segue from our earlier discussion, but to what extent this kind of, you as a Palestinian historian have seen changes in the landscape of American academia over 50 years. And to what extent do you see Orientalism? Are you faced by Orientalism? How do you navigate that and be a nuanced historian of the Middle East?
Let me take the change question, because I think that's the easiest. Yes, you're right. In public discourse, it's Israelis, and Israelis, and then a Palestinian is allowed in as a token. So when you're talking about the media and when you're talking about American politics and much of the rest of public discourse, that's absolutely true at a certain level. On the other hand, in academia, I think there's been a momentous change in the time that I've been aware of these things. I started doing research on stuff like this as an undergraduate, reading about, looking at what was available in the scholarship. Way back in the late 60s. And, there has been an enormous change. There were no proper books on Palestine, with the exception of a very, very, very few. The scholarship was relatively limited in English in the 50s and 60s. And that's changed utterly. I mean, not only in history and anthropology. in cultural studies, in literature. There's a flood of books on Palestine. I mean, I personally can no longer keep up. I only keep up with and am able to read a fragment of the works on modern history. A fragment, a very small subset. There's so much being published. It's not all great, but it's pretty good, a lot of it. And I actually think that so many extraordinarily potent myths and really powerful discursive framings have just been blown away in the past couple of decades. Things that are still believed in public discourse. I mean, their leaders told them to leave, and we get all kinds of nonsense. Make the desert bloom. All of that stuff is still there in public discourse, but in academia, no. So there's been a huge change in academia. That doesn't mean that administrations and boards of trustees and state legislatures are going to let this process continue. There may be we're talking in 2024, a time when, we're seeing McCarthyism on a level not seen since McCarthy in the university, focused on several things, race, several other things than Palestine. But Palestine is one of the key burning issues. And so that this process that I'm talking about, or these developments that I'm talking about, may not continue. But up to this moment, I would say that there's been a sea change.
And on the sea change, I mean, Rashid, do you think that the sea change in terms of you're saying in terms of the availability of a Palestinian narrative narrated by Palestinians themselves? You didn't say narrative, but that's part of it, I assume. But to what extent do you feel, as a Palestinian historian, that so much of the opening was made possible by the fact that in the West, in general terms, they always seem to prefer an Israeli historian? And do you see what I'm saying? That discourse, that you need that validation of the Israeli historians and the Israeli archives to open up the truth about what happened in 1948, irrespective of the fact that Palestinians have been saying this through oral testimonies, through various accounts, for decades and decades before we were validated by the Israeli historians. So how do you deal with that? I mean, is that part of do you see that, in other words, as part of the change, that Palestinian historians and authorship and narration on their own terms are being more accepted, despite the ferocious backlash that we see on campuses today, including at Columbia, where you are?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that there was a long period when what many Arab scholars, Palestinian mainly, had said about, for example, the Nakba was completely ignored until a few Israeli scholars discovered that was true, using mainly Israeli documents. It happened in the late 80s and into the early 90s. And it's still the case that it's very hard to organize certain kinds of events without a demand for quote unquote balance, without a demand for having an Israeli on the podium. That's definitely true. Whereas, institutes of Israel and Jewish studies can have 6 Israelis on a podium and nobody say, where's the balance? Nobody would dream of saying any such thing. So there certainly is that. And it's not just a relic of Orientalism, which is alive and kicking, obviously. It's also a function of the hegemony the Zionist narrative had for over 100 years. I mean, since it started in the 1880s and 90s, and turned into a modern political phenomenon in with the first Zionist Congress and then with the Balfour Declaration. In the West, that narrative has been hegemonic. It's rooted in a biblical narrative that everybody is familiar with, Jews and Christians, and to some extent Muslims. And it is been marketed by the smartest people who have ever done marketing. I mean, whether in film or whether in a variety of other ways. And that's still the case as far as I was just reading a piece in The Intercept about how the New York Times style people prevent the word from occupied Palestine or Palestine from, they're not supposed to use those terms. And you can talk about atrocities, but only if they're Palestinian.
But actually, why are things changing? So why are things? I mean, because you're saying that there's incredible repression, there's propaganda, and you're absolutely right. And there's been an investment in this for decades and decades. But you're saying something is changing. Saying, are you not?
I'm distinguishing between what is being published by Stanford University Press and Yale University Press and every major university press in the country, and the people who are still owning, who still own and still edit and produce the media. Those are two different levels. On an academic level, the kind of nonsense that passed for historical fact in the 50s, 60s, and 70s is completely unacceptable. You cannot peddle those things any longer. They're gone. They're finished. And that's the result, not just of Palestinian scholarship, but of Palestinian, Arab American, and in some cases Israeli scholarship. And on that level, and we're just purely academically, I am not talking about the people who run our universities. I am not talking about the New York Times or CNN or the president or any of these politicians. I'm talking about what is published. I'm talking about what is in journals. I'm talking about what people look. There are 250,000 downloads a year from the Journal of Palestine Studies. Those are mainly graduate students, undergraduates, and academics. That's a level of, you're putting into the mainstream scholarship, mainly by Palestinians, but not only, which was unavailable 40 or 50 years ago.
I agree with you, Rashid, 100%.
Now, there's countervailing trends in academia, obviously, but I think on that level, there has been progress.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. So then how do you explain the silence of the AHA, for example, on the genocide in Gaza? The American Historical Association, which is the largest body of professional historians in the United States that covers the entire profession, so not just U.S. history, but all history, in the largest academy in the world. How do you explain the total silence on Palestine? So I agree with you 100%. There's been a huge shift in academia at one level, but institutionally, we're fighting. Tell me, give us your sense.
I explain it in the same way that I would explain why on our campus, a majority of people in arts and sciences, faculty, are sympathetic to Palestine. And a majority of the tax lawyers and the proctologists and the business professors and the engineering professors, people whose knowledge of Palestine you could put in a thimble, are very supportive of Israel. Well, in the historical profession, you have a huge number of people, a lot of them older people, for whose knowledge of Palestine is nil. If you took the Middle East historians out of the AHA, you would have the kind of vote that you had at MESA, Middle East Studies Association. So we're talking about people. First of all, there's a generational issue here. I'm not saying that the AHA is dominated by much older people, but as you go down the generational pyramid, you get people who are more and more understanding of the Palestinian narrative. And as you go up the generational pyramid, you have people who believe that the movie Exodus is an accurate representation of what happened in Palestine. And that's partly the problem with the AHA, as well as the fact that most of these people know nothing about Palestine or Israel. Overwhelming majority. I mean, I don't go to the AHA because there's so few Middle East historians there. I haven't gone for years. I'm very interested in medieval European history. I'm very interested in American history. But I wouldn't go to a conference which is dominated by American and European history. And that's what the AHA is, because that's what's mainly taught in American universities.
I think, Rashid, I think this is, as a non-historian, I think it's, for me, the way I see it, and because what you're saying to me intuitively makes sense, because it used to be when I was, when we were studying, you couldn't talk about the Nakba outside of sort of Palestinian circles, this kind of thing. Now, and now I would say after October 7th, the question of Nakba in particular has come back, and now it's become routine to talk about it. And then you get historians like Benny Morris who say, "Oh yeah, but we should continue with it." Actually, so it's no longer was there a Nakba or did that happen? It's now what should happen today. It's sort of there's an acknowledgement that it exists. There's an acknowledgement that apartheid exists. There's an acknowledgement that occupation exists. So that kind of stuff when we were students, when you could, when just saying there was Nakba, saying there was occupation, all that kind of stuff was controversial. Today it's not controversial. Today the Israelis and the Israeli defenders in the US and Europe are very much on the defensive, and then find themselves in this weird place where they have to defend war crimes to kind of claim to as their expression of Zionism or pro-Zionism, as opposed to trying to put across a historical narrative which no longer flies, as you're saying, except in, unfortunately, except in Joe Biden's speeches and some of the major, the New York Times and some of the major papers. And this is maybe the last bastion where this kind of history and this kind of knowledge doesn't seem to permeate, for not so much because they don't have access to it, because they're trying to block it. That's my impression. In any case, I want to come back to the question of resistance and to get to the question of what's going on in Gaza today, and the genocide that continues. And you published recently an article in The Guardian, and you talk about sort of Palestinian resistance in general that October 7th in general needs to be seen within this context of the last 100 years. That it's not, as Israelis wanted to say, and their supporters wanted to say, that it's this kind of isolated, that history begins on October 7th and everything has to be interpreted like that. But of course, that it goes back at least these 100 years, and we need not just you as a historian, but all of us as citizens and people following this need to kind of place it in its proper context. So where in this sense, without this active resistance and this active violent resistance, we wouldn't be having this discussion possibly. There would have been, and as far as I know, there were earmarked to have had in March the Saudi-Israeli kind of normalization plan was supposed to take place. There was not going to be any Palestinians or certainly Palestinian leadership involved in it would have been a bit like Camp David in the late 70s. So the Palestinians are excluded. Now, as a result of this, of what's going on, there is a new discussion taking place. So how can we interpret how to think about resistance versus how to think about liberation, which is a separate issue? So what is liberation to you, and what is resistance, and how should we think about this in the context of these 100 years?
Yeah, I mean, the way I resist trying to figure out where we are, and that's something that they tried to push me to do in this Guardian piece, because we're in the middle of a stream that's flowing, and it's very difficult to tell where this thing is going. I don't know if this is going to. I mean, I agree with you in one regard. First of all, resistance is inevitable. Resistance is inevitable. The degree of oppression to which the Palestinians are subjected creates resistance inevitably, no matter what anybody wants. Now, will it always do it in this fashion? Will it always take these forms? No, not necessarily. Did it have to take these forms? No, not necessarily. But there will be resistance. This kind of oppression breeds, creates, forces, imposes, necessitates, resistance. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that I think that you're completely right that what has happened, good, the bad, and the ugly of it. I mean, the sacrifice of 50, perhaps 1,000 people dead. I mean, there are now people talking about there are many more than 7 or 8,000 missing. There probably are 10 or 12,000 missing, which means we're going to be over 50,000 people dead. And the people who are suffering from disease and malnutrition, many of them are going to unnecessarily die. So the question is, this is a huge sacrifice, a humongous sacrifice. But one of the things that has happened, and you're absolutely right about this, is it has pushed discourse in ways that were unimaginable before October 7th. Now, this is a process that has been ongoing over many years. That you could say Nakba, that you could talk about apartheid, that you could talk about war crimes, that you could say a genocide, but you couldn't say them with the conviction and with the general recognition that, yes, that is a legitimate form of discussion. The fact that the New York Times is fighting a rearguard action against it doesn't mean it's any less true. The Intercept piece is amazing on all of these terms, by the way. So I agree with you on both of those counts. I mean, this is something that is inevitable, whether this form of resistance, but there will be resistance. It will continue in Palestine. And there will be Arab support for it, popular support. The question is, the questions are, Will the Arab states continue to play the role of redif, of support and resist and help for Israel? Will the Palestinian leadership continue to be deeply, 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 disastrously divided? I mean, there really is no Palestinian unified leadership. There's no strategy. There's no clear idea of where you want to go. So to ask whether this is going to lead to liberation is actually quite difficult to answer right now, because I don't see a strategy. There's no strategy among the opponents of Hamas, and I'm not quite clear on what Hamas' strategy is, if they have one.
Rashid, you're right.
I mean, resistance is one thing, but liberation, having a strategy to get from where you are to where you want to be and defining what you want to get to, is another thing.
I agree with you, Rashid. But the question, you write in your April 11th piece in The Guardian that, however, if Hamas manages to retain even a fraction of its military capacities after many months of fighting, it can claim a Pyrrhic victory. What do you mean by a Pyrrhic victory in that piece? What do you mean? In what sense is it a Pyrrhic victory as opposed to a political victory? Or is the political victory a Pyrrhic victory?
Well, it's not a political victory unless we know what the aim is, and unless there's progress towards that aim. And I'm not quite clear what the aim is. That's one thing. It's Pyrrhic in the sense that the sacrifice may well be the future of 2 million people in Gaza. I mean, that's a very large percentage of the entire Palestinian population may never live a normal life again. Now, that's a pretty big, that's Pyrrhic. Sorry. Now, Pyrrhus, it was worse. Okay, maybe, but that's the way the term is used. Will there be rebuilding and Palestinian governance of Gaza? Will there be progress towards the achievement of Palestinian national aims? I don't know. I can't say. That's why I resist these attempts, to say in the middle of the stream, where's the stream going? We don't know. The war's not over. The occupation is become more intense than it has ever been in both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. They shoot people with impunity to a degree that even at their worst times and the worst massacres they didn't do. The killing, the level of killing, the level of the willingness to sanction brutality against completely harmless people has reached a level. I mean, these are very, and this may well continue for a very, very long time. And so I think you have when you weigh whether that sentence was conditional. May, I don't know.
So, Rashid, Karim, are you with us? Can you hear us? So, Rashid, we want to wrap at some point soon with the question. Yeah, I can see Karim. I want to wrap on this question because I guess Karim's point was precisely that there's a difference between resistance, as in just affirming, as you said, even in your piece, in your book, as well as in your piece in The Guardian, that Palestinians have always resisted their dispossession and their colonization, and will continue to resist no matter what happens in Gaza. Inevitably, the resistance is going to continue. That's one thing. A path to liberation and a vision of liberation is something else. I think that's what Karim was asking about. But in terms of I guess the thing I want to end with is start ending towards is the question of how. Two questions. One is the question of the U.S. sort of there's a huge debate on Palestine specifically about, and there's a Chomsky wing versus the other wing, which is to say the wing that says that Israel is simply a tool of U.S. empire in the Middle East, as opposed to the Walton Mersheimer sort of wing, which says that there's an Israel lobby that sort of shapes and forms and affects and distorts, in fact, U.S. policy and interests. And I'm wondering where you as a historian, given the 100 Years' War, where do you come down on that question about the U.S. role?
Yeah, I'm not particularly interested in taking either of those two positions. I see it as follows. This project has always depended on external support. It has its own coherence. It has constituted a national entity. It has its own, its own autonomy. but it is ultimately dependent on a metropole, and that metropole is the United States and Western Europe. It is a tool, I think, of the United States. There were periods when this was much more apparent than it is now. During the Cold War, that was absolutely apparent. And that was the period during which the American-Israeli relationship took on the form that it has today, the 60s and the 70s. During the so-called War on Terror, again, Israel was seen as a vital tool of American hegemony in the region. But that, I mean, I think that seems self-evident to me. I don't see why there needs to be a debate about that. Everybody says it. The Israelis say it. The Americans say it. I mean, why are we arguing about it? But I think the important thing is that this project, this state, can only sustain itself with external support from that metropole, which is I'm right now in France. I'm giving talks in Germany. I'm giving talks in different parts of Europe. And it's perfectly clear that these countries of Western Europe and the United States are the sine qua non of the thriving and success of that project. Without that, they are in dire straits. And they know that. And I think we should understand that. And that means that these are important battlefields for resistance, for changing reality. Now, it doesn't get you to liberation unless you have a strategy, unless you know where you're going, unless you have a unified national movement, unless you have support in the Arab world that's able to transcend the opposition of regimes that don't want to do anything that the Americans don't want them to do. And those are big ifs and buts. But I think that we're closer in some respects to changing things than we have ever been. I don't think public opinion in the United States has ever changed so much in so short a time around Israel as it has in these last 6 months. Now, that change can go backwards. Public opinion is fickle, but there are changes going on, generational changes, informational changes, media changes that are irreversible. Old people will die. Younger people who've seen things that they cannot unsee will inherit their wealth, will vote more as they get older, and so on and so forth. Those changes will take time to work themselves through, but they are significant in the long term. They're not going to change the situation in Gaza. Thousands more people will die because the United States policy will not change. They could say to the Israelis tomorrow, you must stop killing civilians. They could say to the Israelis tomorrow, you must open all 12 crossing points. You must allow 800 trucks in a day. You must allow the thousands of tons of flour that we have sitting and are paying customs duties on in Ashdod into Gaza. But they won't do that. So thousands of people will die. So in the short term, no. But in the long term, with the possibility of reverses, this change will, I think, contribute. Now, a lot depends on the Palestinians. I keep saying this, getting their act together. We have to overcome the divisions. We have to come to a clear understanding of where we want to go. What do we want to do with the Israelis? How many people who would have been perfectly happy to figure out some way of living with Israelis, Palestinians, in a one state or a two state or a cantonal or a binational or a confederal or some other framework, say to themselves today, we can't live with them. Look at what they've done. And a lot of Israelis are saying the same thing, who were perfectly willing to do the same, to coexist within one of these multiple frameworks that I've talked about. How do you get over that? How do you deal with that? I don't know. I mean, but that's a question that is on the table today for a lot of people and should be. And we should be thinking about that. Nobody wants to think about it, but we have to think about it. They have to think about it. Do they really think they can kill and suppress Palestinians until the end of time with the support of the liberal democratic countries of the West? No, they cannot. Tony Judd said it. It's a project that was born out of time. It missed its moment. If they had started in the 18th century, they would have gotten away with it. They would have done to Palestinians what was done to people in New Zealand or Australia or Canada or the United States. They started,
but that's what they're trying to do, Rashid. No,
not their fault.
Isn't that what they're trying to do right now? Isn't that they're trying to catch up on time in a sense and try to obliterate as many Palestinians as possible? That's what they're trying to do. So
It is apparently what they're doing. Yeah, that would certainly seem to be the case.
Just can I ask a final question, just to go back to the beginning in a sense, and you in your book and in this article and this kind of the long 100 years that we've been talking about, at least these two major trends that the Israelis, as I think you are talking about, learned from the British colonial forces, which is one, which is to ensure there's always this division within the leadership and within the factions. What today are the factions, and the second is this. I think you talked about their security doctrine, meaning not so much a question of deterrence. I think you referred to it in your Guardian article, but one where it's mowing the lawn. And that goes back to the 30s. This business of you basically beat them, beat until there's nothing left of them, and that's the only way that you can get them to do what you want. There's no point in negotiating, no point in anything. So with this in mind. And as far as I can see, whether it's Netanyahu or Gantz or any of them, I mean, I personally don't see much difference between all these different politicians that they try. The U.S. is trying now to maybe distinguish Netanyahu from the rest as a way to eventually kind of, come up with something. But, as far as I can see, they're all the same. There doesn't seem to be much of a political objective. It seems to be purely military. It's going back to this notion of you have to defeat them at all costs. You have to make them submit at all costs. And then once they've submitted, then we'll give them something, whether it's through the normalization with the Saudis and then we throw them something, or some nominal, bring back the Palestinian Authority and put them in Gaza somewhere, something along these lines. So the question, Rashid, I have in closing, in a sense, is, and you've not only written a lot about the PLO, but you advised them. You worked at some point with the Palestinian leadership in the old days, at least. And what is the role now of the PLO? I mean, I know it's moribund, so it doesn't really exist much. But is there? We talked in a previous podcast with Hanan Ashrawi, with others. Is there a possibility of resuscitating this PLO, since it's the only institution that represents all Palestinians inside and outside? Is that a pipe dream? How does one get around this colonial 100-year of dividing when we see it today? So Hamas is trying to kind of reach some kind of political understanding, and at the same time, you see the Palestinian Authority and others who are trying to, make sure that Hamas doesn't get any political advantage out of this.
Well, there has got to be a Palestinian interlocutor that is representative of the Palestinians. And that means that everybody has to be there, including the guys with the guns. No settler, colonial, or for that matter, colonial conflict was ever resolved without that happening. And the fact that the United States and unfortunately the Palestinian Authority are doing everything possible to prevent that, and Israel obviously, means that they have no interest in actually having this resolved. You don't negotiate with the IRA. You don't get, a deal in Northern Ireland. You don't negotiate with the ANC, and you don't get a deal in South Africa. You don't bring all the Palestinian tendencies together and have them put forward their representation, and you don't have a possibility of a resolution. It's as simple as that. And to some extent, this is down to the Palestinians. You can talk about how much the United States and Israel and the Arab regimes are playing politics with the Palestinians and dividing them and so on, but you can do that till the cows come home. But ultimately, the Palestinians have to overcome those divisions and those external interferences, which are designed to prevent a resolution, which are designed to serve Israeli or American or Arab regime interests. And I fault a lot of Palestinian leaderships, not just the Palestinian Authority, which is the most culpable in that regard. But I fault them all, actually. And I think that the day that the Palestinians are able to pull this together through, I think I may be right, through resuscitation of the PLO and imposing that as the interlocutor for the Palestinians, will be a day when we have a possibility of a resolution. Now, how and where and when and on what basis, I don't know. And it may not be for a little while, unfortunately.
I want to wrap with one last question in terms of, if you had to, you have at this point, I think you have grandkids, if I'm not mistaken.
I have 4, count them, 4.
Wonderful. Thank you. What do you tell them and students, young students? I'm not talking about PhD students. I'm talking about young students, undergraduates that you deal with at Columbia and others. What do you tell them now in the face of this possibility of change, in the face of genocide, in the moment of genocide? How do you tell them to remain hopeful without sounding like sort of pie in the sky? How do you keep them focused? What does history tell us and teach you and teach us and teach the next generation about how this is, what their responsibility and what their role is?
Yeah. That's a tough question. I mean, one thing I tell them is that I don't think this project can succeed. I don't think you can impose on the Palestinians what the Zionist project is trying to impose. I don't think it can succeed, not in the 21st century. Unfortunately, it can go on for a very long time. The second thing is that however bleak things are in Palestine, and they've just been getting bleaker and bleaker, God knows, I really see signs of change outside. I think some very frozen power structures are beginning to crumble. I think that pressure is beginning that never really existed before. And it may not work this time, but maybe, heaven forbid, the next genocide. The degree to which even democratic governments, or perhaps even especially democratic governments, are resistant to pressure from public opinion is extraordinary. I mean, look at how many years it took to end the Vietnam War, how many years it took to end the Iraq War. Public opinion turned against those wars very early on, actually. By the time I graduated in 1970, public opinion had turned against the Vietnam War. It took 5 more years to end it, the American part of the war. The Iraq War was the same. Just after Bush was reelected, public opinion turned against that war. It took years to get the United States out of Iraq. I'm not saying it's the same in any way, but it's an example of how nominally democratic governments are obviously like huge ships that just go on and on, whatever their peoples want. They just, the foreign policy establishment and the consensus and the aged political leaderships who got their ideas in the 50s and the 60s and who are never going to change. It takes a long time to force a change on them. But I actually am, in that respect, I'm optimistic. Maybe not, in 2024, 2025, but it's, and a lot of people will die. And there's going to be a lot of suffering, unfortunately. But I that's what I would tell people. This is not this. You can't do what Israel is trying to do. You cannot get away with it. And I don't think they're actually getting away with it. With world public opinion, and with American public opinion, and with European public opinion, they are not getting away with it. With the barons of the media, with the people who own our politicians and give them $1 million donations, they're getting away with it. Okay? So that, unfortunately, hasn't changed, or not changed enough. But on another level, on a popular level, I've never seen anything. I mean, hundreds of trade unions coming out for a ceasefire in the United States. Who ever heard of that? 100 black pastors demanding a ceasefire. Who ever heard of that? Those things have never happened in American history. Dozens and dozens of congressmen and 17 senators opposing their president. Go back to Woodrow Wilson and try and see a time when more than one person dared to stick their head above the parapet, and they were shot off. They were shot down. Whether it's McCluskey or whether it's Charles Percy or whether it's Abu Rizk. They had very short, times in Congress once they came out in support of something that, was objectionable to the party line. That's changing. I'm not saying it's going to change everything tomorrow and the massacres and the genocide will end, or that the media will suddenly report the truth. No, the mainstream media will not. and the politicians are endlessly corrupt. But there is a beginning of a change. And that's what I tell people, for people young enough, the kind of people you're talking about, that young, there's a lot of hope, I think. Maybe not for people as old as me, but for the young ones.
On that point, Rashid, thank you so much for your time and your patience and your ability and your willingness to deal with two of the three Makdisi brothers. So we thank you sincerely, and we look forward to the liberation of Palestine sooner rather than later. But thank you, Rashid.
Well, guys, what did you think? I thought this discussion with Rashid was really interesting, especially from sort of the history of it. I think there's a bunch of things related to leadership, to institution building, but also to the role of Abdel Nasser and to the axis of resistance. So this similarities in a sense between the early kind of mandate period and perhaps what we're going through now. Sama, what did you think?
Yeah, I thought it was a great discussion. I think we had a good intellectual exchange with Rashid. And the beautiful part is that we all agree fundamentally, Rashid and us, of course, on the basic issues about Palestine, the injustice, the 100 Years' War that he talks about in his book, and that we have, that anyone who actually knows the history is aware of. On the other hand, there are these other issues that get debated all the time. And so I thought it was actually a good opportunity for us and for our listeners and viewers to actually get a sense of the kinds of discussions and debates that happen, within the those who support Palestinian liberation. So I thought it was a productive discussion. Sadi, you weren't on the show. I mean, I wish you were, but what did you think since you've had a chance to listen to the rough cut?
I'm sorry I missed the show. First of all, my flights got rearranged at the last minute, and I couldn't make it. But I thought it was a really, really great and really rich discussion that you guys had with Rashid. And for me, as somebody who knows the more recent stuff better than the historical stuff, some of the most interesting parts of the discussion had to do with that earlier moment. And one of the points that resonated with me most clearly was Rashid's discussion of that 1930s, 1940s moment when he talked about the Zionists basically learning at the knees of the British Empire how to do it, like Empire 101. How do you play the game of divide and rule? How do you manage an occupied and colonized population? How do you learn the lessons that the British learned through over decades, if not centuries, of imperial power in places like Ireland and India? The Zionists learned all those tricks, the tools of the trade, basically, of empire. I thought that was really, really fascinating and stuff that people don't know so much, right? I thought that was great.
Yes, I thought so too. And Karim, to get back to you, I thought one of the most interesting exchanges was the discussion around the question of resistance and Palestine, and both in the 1950s and then more recently, the whole idea of how do we think about the idea of Palestine being obviously a cause of justice and an obvious cause for people in the region that doesn't require debate or discussion. It's so obvious, right and wrong, as it is, I think, to the vast majority of the world today. On the other hand, there's also this question of regimes, and you and I, Karim, have discussed this many, many times, the question of regimes and governments in the region that have their own particular dynastic or regional or whatever national interests, or personal interest for that matter. And how does one balance this sort of an appreciation of the fact that there is a real cause that people do identify with, including oftentimes, especially in the 50s, leaders, Abdel Nasser, as opposed to the way the cause of Palestine gets used. So what is your thinking, and how do you think our listeners and viewers should think about this question of a cause and the way a cause gets manipulated or used?
Yeah, I don't know how the listeners should be dealing with this, but for me, I think just going back to your question of resistance, I think I'm always trying to push on how we should be trying to understand resistance, in this early phase that Rashid talked about during the mandate onwards, in the whole thesis of a 100-year war up until today. And so how does one assess the role that, the now kind of perhaps failed role that we can look back at people like Yasser Arafat and the PLO at the time? It succeeded at a certain level and then failed when it came to the so-called conflict resolution stage or the negotiation stage or the kind of the overtly political stage. And then we see now, we're at the perhaps the beginnings of trying to see, okay, how is Hamas going to be dealing with this? Soon, hopefully, very, very soon, this genocide in its current phase will be over. And, the more political questions about, will Hamas emerge in a sense the way the PLO did or Fatah did in its time? And what role can it play? And what role will it be allowed to play? And what about these larger colonial structures that won't let any Palestinian movement, whether one likes them or not, whether one likes the methods used or one doesn't like the methods used, but pushing for a certain form of liberation, a certain form of resistance, they won't be allowed by the colonial structures in place. In this case, the United States, before it was the British, and others in between. How does one think about self-determination in relation to liberation, in relation to violence, in relation to all these resistances? What role in the axis of resistance in which, some, for example, in Lebanon and other parts would see what the Iranians did when they attacked the Israelis for the first time, and it was very dramatic, as, oh, this is just theater. So they kind of dispelled this, this notion that, Iran doesn't particularly care about Palestine or Palestinians. It's not very important. But the question I had for Rashid was, does that matter? I mean, does the Iranians have to be in love or follow the Palestinians or care about every little thing about Palestine? Or is there a way in which trying to challenge a larger structure plays a role within which Palestinians themselves can then have more space to have their politics? Maybe not. Maybe not. I'm not sure. So I thought the relationship between the early phases of leadership and the way in which the British crushed leadership and crushed institutions at the same time, as Sari said, enabling Israeli kind of proto-Zionist and Israeli institutions and army and military and use of all the kind of military tactics. We see the similar thing in the 90s, where they kind of effectively, they don't crush institutions, but they mold them in a way that turns them into part of the occupation, while they kept on allowing Israeli institutions to grow and kept on with this liberal nonsense of Israeli democracy, and all the while settlements were growing until we get to this stage. So this is where we are. So I'm curious, Sadi, what do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the comparisons between that mandate 1930s, 1940s moment and now are really, really striking. But going, but I mean, like, just for instance, among other things, people often talk about 1948 and they say, well, why did the Palestinians fail so badly in 1948? One of the lessons of Rashid's work is that, well, one reason why the resistance in 1948 wasn't so effective is that the British had destroyed it in the 1930s. Basically, there was nothing left when push came to shove in 1948. All the potential leaders had been jailed or shot or assassinated or whatever. And that part of your discussion, actually, now that I'm remembering it, part of the discussion you had with him brings up this question of Israeli assassinations, like this assassination program that he talked about too. That goes where they systematically assassinate. We know people, in fact, we from our own experience, we know of people who've been assassinated by the Israelis, including Gamal Nasser and many other writers and intellectuals and obviously political figures as well who've been assassinated by the Israelis. So when that question comes up, as it so often does, who is the Palestinian Mandela? I mean, surely one of the answers is, well, I don't know, but in all likelihood, whoever the Palestinian Mandela might have been was assassinated by the Israelis at some point, or is in one of their prisons or jails or whatever. So, yeah. By the way, I wanted to ask you guys, based on your conversation with Rashid, because speaking of historical parallels, I wonder whether, people often talk about in the context of Gaza today, it can, I mean, I don't know how to put this properly, but, is how to express this? Is Hamas to Gaza now like the PLO to Beirut 1982? Or are they similar situations? But another sort of historical parallel that I wonder, maybe it's more proximate, is it more like the PLO 1968 after the Battle of Karami? I don't know if that didn't really come up in your conversation, but I wonder, going back to those earlier echoes, what do you guys think? Is this like Karami or like Beirut 82, or where do you, or is it Sabran Shatila? I mean, if we were to look for a recent episode, and specifically Palestinian history, what would you go back to? Do you think?
Well, I think it's I mean, I think there are parallels in all those instances, but I think, of course, I mean, the obvious point is that it's its own moment, and this is an unprecedented. We're in unprecedented territory in the sense of both the duration. Just think about how long Gaza has been pulverized by the Israelis for over, now we're into the 7th month, and the longest Arab-Israeli war, so was never this long, and certainly 67 was 6 days. And so the idea of, so something has fundamentally shifted. I think the more apt, I mean, Sadie, I see your point, but I think the more apt, discussion is the whole concept, the Israeli concept of the Iron Wall, which is their doctrine vis-a-vis smashing and crushing any hope of Palestinian resistance, and just asphyxiating Palestinian aspirations for freedom and liberation as a precondition for normalization and sort of so-called peace in the region. I think that's what was shattered. I think that's the continuity from 68 to, I mean, Karami, of course, was like this symbolic thing, but what's going on now in 2006 in Lebanon, because you should relate all these things together. All these moments together sort of add up to the idea that what was in 68 barely imaginable, but became imaginable through things like the Battle of Karami, has now taken on a very different form and a much more sort of potent form. And then there's the whole, as I think the most interesting aspect for me is the question of not just seeing Palestine on its own. And this is the point Karim kept bringing us back to in the discussion, which is link it to a regional geopolitical context and don't see them as necessarily as zero-sum games. It's not either one is for Iranian interests or one is for Palestine. It's the way these things interact with each other and how each side and actor uses this shifting geopolitical environment. But I think the point is the linkage is in 48, in 36, the Palestinians resisted and were crushed and ethnically cleansed. And part of what Rashid was saying, despite his blaming the leadership, is that he also, was frank, and he admitted, and we discussed this, and he said things like they had no chance, in a sense. Isn't that what he said at Sam Karim? Isn't that what he said, kind of more or less? They had no chance because the system was structured in such a way that it was impossible. So given the hostility of the Western imperial colonial geopolitical system and the structures put in place and the destruction of Palestinian institutions and the development of Zionist institutions in the Mandate, 48 was inevitable in a certain kind of way. And what we see now is an attempt to sort of an indication that project hasn't succeeded in the totality that Zionists would have liked to think, right? Or that's my sense.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And I want to go back to what Sari is asking. I mean, for me, the link is mostly, I mean, what comes to mind, I mean, some of you are the historian, I'm just, for me, it's 2006. I see a lot of similarities in the, of course, it's much more dramatic now, and sort of like genocide as opposed to this kind of attack. But this notion of the Israeli military failure, and no matter what happens, this is a massive Israeli military failure in Gaza, just as it was in Lebanon in 2006, along with huge civilian suffering in Lebanon at the time in the context, and now obviously through a genocide. So this dual thing of one being able to inflict mass suffering on civilians and people that can't fight back, versus being unable to defeat militarily those armed forces that are fighting on the ground. And I think that this is what to me is really, really striking. And it's interesting now when you're following the regional news, you see, we talk about negotiations between the Americans and the Iranians. These are the two main players. You don't hear about, it's the Israelis and the Iranians. You hear Iranians and the Americans. And the Americans are kind of, working as proxies for the Israelis. So these are the two main forces, and those in the Gulf that we're going to talk about, I think, in the next podcast. In the Gulf, they're trying to avoid having a regional war. They're trying to say we don't want to get dragged into a regional war where we're going to be part of this war, and we don't want to be fighting. We want actually to be negotiating with the Iranians and coming up with a deal. I think that's the trend. So the more the Israelis inflict this pain and the more they lose militarily over the past 10, 15 years, the more it switches away from them having actual agency, meaning that as soon as the US goes a certain direction, the Israelis have to jump with them. And I think this becomes, more and more clear. And I think this is interesting something we need to kind of think about more, I think, in forthcoming podcasts. No, in other words, nobody cares what the Israelis.
Yeah, in fact,
Right.
in a forthcoming podcast, we're going to have.
Like, nobody cares about what the Israelis are saying. If you like read through it, nobody cares. We're all looking to see, will the Americans just put their foot down and tell the Israelis to shut up, basically? Will the Americans have the channels and keep the channels talking to the Iranians and the Saudis and the others? For the Israelis, it's all about, can they just shut them up and make sure that they don't, start a war?
Yeah, but on the other hand, the U.S. Congress just passed yet another $26 billion for the Israelis. So again, this question of dog and tail and what, who's wagging what, etc. We're going to be that we have another upcoming podcast episode to discuss American foreign policy and the relationship between the foreign and the domestic and so forth, which we'll obviously get to. But maybe we should stop here for this one. I think it was a really, really enriching discussion, and if I may say so, I think it's part of what we enjoy about this podcast is the fact that when we talk to people like Rashid or all of our other guests, we're not just, we're people who actually know something about between the three of us anyway, we know the history, the politics, the region, through Karim, the international legal aspects. Like we can cover a lot of bases. It helps make these conversations, I think, on this channel particularly rewarding. So thank you very much, everyone, and we will see you for the next one.